So today I want to talk about the inadequacy of the state to protect rights. Last time, I talked about why the Democrats could not save Roe v. Wade. And in that video, I talked about how the class interests of the Democrats did not align with the types of policies that would allow for abortion access. Today, I want to talk about how it is that the state is inadequate at protecting rights in general via the lens of abortion. So let's just jump right in and talk about how rights can always be taken away by the state. Without getting into leftist criticisms or the legal justifications for Roe v. Wade itself for this video, I think it's sufficient to start this off by reminding people that there's technically nothing medically stopping the average pregnant person from having an abortion except access. That includes access to medications or any other additional medical care and procedures that would ensure it's done in a safe fashion at the person's discretion. After all, abortion should be recognized as an issue of purely bodily autonomy. And for an issue of bodily autonomy such as this one, it is not absurd to question whether or not even the public debate of such a personal decision is in fact a violation of a person's rights. I know that for some of you who watch this, you may not have to imagine this at all. But for those of you who've never experienced anything like this, imagine if personal decisions between you and your physician were brought out into public and fought about daily. If you were constantly questioned for the decisions that you made and were considered morally wrong for making said decisions about your own health and well-being. That's the lived experience and reality for many people. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about this as a bodily autonomy issue. Now, given the reality that there isn't actually anything physically stopping most pregnant individuals from terminating their pregnancy, and given the fact that there were no laws prohibiting abortion before 1821 for free individuals, I believe it's really necessary to acknowledge that the laws developed throughout the 19th century represented a removal of rights through the violence of the state. A violence that, I might add, was already applied by the state towards those who were enslaved by legally enabling slave owners to do this through the legal process. That said, all it took to bring forth these all-encompassing laws was the economic interests of men who were physicians to produce propaganda campaigns and advocate for state violence through the criminalization process to take away the rights of individuals. And again, all of this was done through their economic interests. By 1910 in the United States, they got their way, and all of those rights were thoroughly eliminated. And if a right can be taken away, then an important question that needs to be asked is it really a right then? And if not, what exactly is it? Well, to answer that, let's talk a little bit about when abortion was made legal again. When numerous states legalized abortion under certain circumstances, and when the Roe v. Wade decision was made, the state decided, using its own structures, to no longer penalize and coerce people via state violence. Should we then consider this the granting of rights by the state? Well, personally, I'd argue no. Far from granting rights, it granted permission for individuals to do what they were already capable of without the threat of the law. I just want to remind you that we've established that there's nothing physically or medically stopping most people from getting this procedure done except the threat of violence from the state. And so if you remove that threat, then all that's left really is the permission from the state to not give you that threat again. If you have any doubts about the capacity for people to do this, I just turn to the real history of underground abortions that were occurring throughout all of the mid-20th century, where organizations such as the Jane Collective were providing access to abortion care at great personal risk. Specifically, the risk that they faced was the state coming down on them and trying to arrest them and cause violence to occur. For several years before the Roe v. Wade decision made abortion legal nationally, This was the experience of most people trying to get access to something they could already physically do. Nobody gained the right or ability to get this procedure from the law. They just were no longer punished for doing so as a change in policy. And the truth is that even with this granting of these imperfect permissions, these permissions can and have been changed through the legislative process. And both freedom and access can be curtailed at any time. Therefore, how can we really define any of this as a right when the permissions can constantly be changed? And further, who gets access to these permissions can be changed. All we need to do is to look at the numerous conservative attacks on abortion rights and access that occurred after Roe v. Wade decision was made. Take, for example, the Hyde Amendment, which passed in 1976, which prevented federal funding from being used to provide abortions. What it essentially did is allowed for a further tiered system of legal rights. Individuals with any federally provided health insurance were no longer guaranteed abortion coverage because federal money could not be spent to provide abortion care. This meant that people receiving health care from Indian Health Services, from the military, through Medicaid, or people who were in federal prisons seeking medical care no longer had the same rights as everyone else. Worse yet, the Supreme Court upheld this decision in Harris versus McRae, and both the Republican and Democrat legislatures maintained the Hyde Amendment until 2021. And over the following decades after Roe was passed, conservatives were given massive donation packages from wealthy donors and corporations in order to pass hostile laws that put limits and restrictions on how one was to receive medical care and create further gatekeeping. A few wealthy donors and a religious minority were able to produce laws that made people have to seek permission from the state, as well as permission from spouses, forced people to sit down and listen to propaganda that had no reality in medical science, and forced clinics to shut down that were providing important care by creating unrealistic expectations for them. This was all done using the power of the state and its upholding of private capital over the needs of people. It created a system where about only 6 US states only had one clinic available, and where some areas only had one clinic in the span of 40,000 square miles, effectively making access impossible for many. Now, unsurprisingly, the Supreme Court upheld the majority of these burdensome laws in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The Casey ruling made it so that many of these restrictions could be implemented on a state level and made it that much more difficult to challenge abortion restrictions. While it did maintain a right to an abortion, the ruling changed the state's legal understanding of how that right would be enforced by the state. Conditions were added that forced individuals to prove that they were experiencing undue burdens in order to receive help from the state for their case, whereas under Roe v. Wade, the state was supposed to step in and defend its own interests as well as the rights of the individual. And so all of that burden really fell down to people to try to prove that they shouldn't have burdens put on them in order to do something that, again, they are physically capable of doing. Now, just by looking at the history of abortion rights in the US, we can see that the state can add restrictions, give permission back for things it once restricted, change how it enforces restrictions, force people to endure burdens as restrictions, limit access in numerous ways, and yes, even remove rights entirely through the violence of the state, supported by a class interest and private capital. And this is about to be what happens and is about to be what manifests when Alito's draft turns into an official decision. Given this malleability of rights and permissions, there's no way we can expect the states to ever defend our rights to do things. And if these arguments about the state were not compelling for you in regards to abortion, I do want to step away from that particular conversation for one moment to maybe change the framing. And I'd ask any of you viewers of this video to consider other instances in US history, or global history, but I'm focused primarily in US history, where rights were taken away to further examine how it is that we cannot trust the state to protect our rights. Consider things like Japanese internment, the institution of slavery, and all of its modified iterations over the years, the denial of vote to felons, workers' rights since the 1980s and the destruction of the labor movement, Indian boarding schools, the policies of the eugenics movement, or even something as recent as the Supreme Court decision to allow Border Patrol agents to violate the Fourth Amendment. These are just quick examples, and one can probably think of many more instances throughout US history where rights were taken by the government, and all of this is not even considering the unequal application of rights or the realities of different socioeconomic conditions in the United States. The fact is, the state cannot secure rights, when those rights can literally just be taken away with the stroke of a pen, especially when the pen is controlled by those with wealth, privilege, and power. So with that said, I do want to acknowledge that we do live under the rules of the state. So understanding them can be beneficial for if for no other reason than survival. So I hope you'll join me next time where I discuss the legal justification for Roe v. Wade, as well as some of its alternatives under the liberal system. So if you've watched what you've liked, I do hope that you consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and joining my Discord. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.